when we're thinking about the relevance of cultural history, there are generally two standard answers. One is that we study the past for its own sake. We study the past in its own terms on the one hand, and on the other, we study the past for its relevance. The second answer, we study the past for its relevance, is normally dismissed by serious cultural historians because they call it presentism. But I personally think it's time we started rethinking the idea that we study the past for its own sake, in its own terms. For a start, I think it's wrong. We study the past because we're impelled to study the past. We're impelled to study the past because we are in a present that prompts us, that pushes us, that compels us to look to the past in order to understand our present predicament. So I think it's wrong, but I also think it's a way of making the humanities relevant, making the humanities flourish in the contemporary university, because it's a way of saying that we're part of a tradition, that we receive tradition not in a kind of abstract, objective way. We receive tradition, we receive our past by virtue of being part of that past, and that once we understand that, then cultural history starts to look very different. It's not that we study it simply for its relevance, but it's certainly neither for we study it for its own sake. On the contrary, we study it as part of a tradition of which we are a part. We are part of history's problem, but also we're part of history's solution, I would say, and that's why we study cultural history, to understand ourselves and our position and our reformist possibilities within a historical tradition. So I'm all in favour of shifting this idea of studying the past for its own sake. This is a powerful philological, historiographical principle, model which almost every historian and probably lots of literary historians would promote if you asked them. I think it's time we need to rethink that. I don't think it's doing us any favours right now. Well, I grew up in a configuration called medieval studies, that as a graduate student I was part of, I was committed to medieval studies. I was no less than the secretary of the London Medieval Society in the 1980s. And all the while I was part of it, I was thinking, no, I'm not easy in this configuration. I then wrote a book called Reform and Cultural Revolution, which ran from 1350 to 1547. All of a sudden I moved across the boundary of the standard end of the Middle Ages, which might be 1485 or 1500 or 1509, take your pick. I ran across that right up to the death of Henry VIII, and therefore embracing the Reformation centuries. And I suddenly discovered that the category within which I'd been working, medieval studies, was the creation of the Reformation, and it was the creation designed to demonize, repudiate, and mock the so-called Middle Ages. I suddenly understood that the scholarly configuration in which I had grown up was the creation of someone else. And I wasn't happy with this creation. I wasn't happy with that configuration. And I suddenly realized, or over the process of writing this book, realized that our own cultural understanding is profoundly stunted as long as we remain within the periodic boxes that cultural history assigns to our field. I think these periodic boundaries are often designed so as most to neutralize the real, dynamic, burning interest and illumination of cultural history. It's precisely by transgressing those periodic boundaries that we understand our period. Once you set the Middle Ages into dialogue with early modernity, then both start to look very, very different. Early modernity looks a lot darker. The medieval looks like an alternative to, in some ways, and in other ways a preparation for that dark early modernity to come. But you've got to set them into conversation with each other if you want to understand yourself. I took the opportunity of this wonderful conference on reading the face in Melbourne last week. I took the wonderful opportunity of that conference to think about how reading the face might contribute to the ways in which we think about the humanities generally. When university presidents talk about the humanities, they do so in the very same terms that they talk about the sciences. They talk about the discovery that the humanities make, the discoveries. I'm not sure, which is the way they talk about the sciences. Now, for the sciences, that is no doubt true and pertinent. But I'm not sure that talking about the humanities as discovery is an accurate description of our actual practice. And neither am I sure it's a good idea to set our epistemological project up against the sciences, because if we try and compete with the sciences on their terms, there's only one thing for sure, which is that we're going to lose. And I don't want to lose. I'm sure the humanities don't want to lose. It's not our interest to lose. We've got to think of a new way of presenting what I'm calling our epistemological project. I think our epistemological project, our production of knowledge, to use a simpler term, is better described as recovery than discovery. Knowledge in the humanities is that which has been lost and found and lost again and again, many times over. So that we have to think about recognition as the prime model, the key moment of our knowledge in the humanities. We have to be trained to read the past, and as we're trained, we recognize ourselves and our loved ones, those who inspire us in the past. It's the moments of recognition that really set the humanities alight. Now, this might seem like a purely conservative version of knowledge. If I say, as I do say in that talk, that cognition is actually in the humanities recognition, then the implication of that is that what's to know has already been known at some point in the past. To a certain degree, I'm indeed saying that what we do is discovering what's been known, what's been felt, what's been experienced in the past. But the moment of recognition is something specific to the present. The moment of recognition does look to the past, but it changes the present. It's not completely conservative. It recognizes the past, to be sure, but in so doing, it reforms the present. Think of those moments where you recognize your loved ones, you recognize the image of a person in your family who's passed away. These are intense moments looking to the past, but they are also inspiring moments. You remember all about that person that inspired you. I have photos of my loved ones in my bedroom, and I see them every single morning, and every single morning I recognize them, but I don't think, oh, they're in the past. No, I think by virtue of this recognition that they are inspiring me, reforming me in the present. I think that is a better model for knowledge in the humanities, a model of recovery, of recognition, than a model of discovering the wholly new. That's what the sciences do. We do something different. Well, one serious defense of the humanities, and particularly literary pedagogy, over the last century has always been, consistently been, that study of literature, study of the humanities, but particularly literature and the arts, focuses on emotion, focuses on what it felt like. Other forms of history tell us about political history, what people thought, tell us about social structures. They don't tell us how it felt. works of literature are always telling us how it felt. They're seeing history from the inside. So insofar as that's true, then I think pretty well all work in the humanities is driven by a commitment to a history of the emotions. I find that a plausible account, and it's certainly true of what I do. It's particularly true of what I do given what I was just saying about the importance of recognition. Recognition always involves an emotional connection. When you recognize that which you've loved in the past, then there follows not only a cognitional experience, but an emotional experience. It involves the whole self, both cognition and emotion. So my own understanding of the humanities as an act of recovery is also necessarily about the humanities as part of contributing to a history of the emotions. But I think the kind of work I'm doing now about early modernity is particularly pertinent to the history of emotions, insofar as it seems to me that Protestantism produces a spirituality which is wholly psychologized and, if you will, emotionalized. That the Protestant who believes in predestination must question themselves as to whether or not they are among the elect. The answer to that question can only be found in one's emotional experience. Today I was feeling great. I had this rush of gratitude. Everything was rolling my way. I think I've made it. Tomorrow, well, I had this dry patch and I'm just wondering about that. It's all about emotion. It's an impossible challenge to decide whether or not you're among the saved. But impossible or not, it's only ever answerable, addressable through the question of emotional response. So I think the question of the history of emotions becomes particularly true when people are thrown on their own resources in a way that the unmediated relationship between Christians and their God does throw Christians on their own resources from the 16th century. That unmediated relationship offers no institutional forms for certainty. All it says to Christians is, are you saved? Have you been saved? Has the decision gone in your favour? And as I say, you can only address that question by reference to one's emotional experience. The historian of the 16th and 17th centuries, the historian of early European modernity, must therefore necessarily be a historian of the emotions. I think absolutely I wouldn't do cultural history if I didn't feel that were the case. As I said earlier, I'm not only interested in studying the past for its own sake. In fact, I don't think that's indeed possible, and neither would I particularly want to make it possible. History doesn't stop. History resurfaces. History remains relevant. We have to make, as historians, history whole. So I feel that about all cultural history. I particularly feel that about the 16th and 17th century right now, because I am increasingly persuaded that crucial aspects of our own current cultural practice are only intelligible within the perspective or through the lens of what happened in the 16th century. Take, for example, our relation to images. We walk into galleries all the time. When we walk into it, we feel this is a sacred space. This is very beautiful. It's quiet. It's calm. It's protected. Those galleries have big, thick walls, and they have security guards. We do that all the time. It's a very precious experience for us, our connection with art. Why should that particular formation have happened? In my view, it's only intelligible within the longer history of the West's very tortured relationship with the image. In the 16th century, in the 17th century, England, for example, experienced 100 years of legislated iconoclasm. Every single religious image in England had to be, by legislative fiat, destroyed. That produces a counter-response in the 17th century. It produces a counter-response of saying, hey, we love these images that we're having to destroy. We've got to think of some other solution besides destroying all the images. Is so exhausting and it's not much fun. And the work never seems to be done. There are always more religious images. So what do? This is what we do. We invent the idea of the art gallery. Art galleries begin in the 1630s. We invent a new discourse, which was going to become the discourse of aesthetics. And we also invent a new class for viewing the image, which is the class that is capable of paying what it actually costs to get into these beautiful, protected art galleries. But we understand the art gallery as a response to iconoclasm. Those big thick walls are not only because people are going to pinch the images, but thieves are going to steal the paintings, but also because the gallery from the beginning was a place of asylum. As the image was threatened in the church, so too it moved to the gallery. As we explain, as we understand what we're doing in an art gallery, in our very common experience of going into one, we can only understand that fully, I think, by reference to past cultural history, particularly the history of the 16th and 17th centuries. I think I would ask exactly that question. It's the question I'm always asking every single day about just about every experience I have, every cultural experience I have, in response to, I don't know, this campus, in response to the Romanesque cloister I see not 100 yards away in the University of Western Australia. I say, how do we get here? Why are we doing that? Why do we make that choice for that cultural form? What does that say about us? What does that say about our past? How do we understand ourselves through that question? I think it's the grand master question of all cultural history. How did we get here?